Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Elhamdülillahi vahde ve salatu ve selamu ala men la nebiye ba'de. Selamu alaikum ve rahmetullahi ve berekatuhu. I'm going to speak in English, inshallah, just to diversify the presentations, inshallah. And also, bir hoca bana söylemişti ki ya Türkçe mi sunum vereyim ya İngilizce mi vereyim? Sonra bir arkadaş söyledi, sen İngilizceye devam et hocam. Ben dedim ne için? Daha çok bilimsel olur söyledi. O yüzden İngilizce konuşursanız daha iyi olur senin için. Ben de tamam kabul ettim. Bundan sonra sunumların hepsini İngilizce yapacağım inşallah Türkiye'de. So coming to the topic, what I'd like to talk about, and I removed the review of the Islamic literature because I felt within a half an hour time frame it would be too much to be able to fit in and do justice to the topic, especially such a sensitive topic that requires a little bit more investigation. But what I'd like to do today is to really present to you the psychological differences between males and females. Is there one? And if there is one, what are those differences? So that's what we're going to go through today. So first of all, it's important to note for the past century, right, since the birth of modern psychology, since the early 1900s, psychology has always and clearly has had studies to indicate that there is not only a biological difference between males and females, but a psychological difference between males and females. This has become further emphasized in the past 30 years, and this evidence has been pretty compelling. And I'm going to kind of discuss with you the nature of this evidence, inshallah. However, of course, this data does not necessarily fit very well in an increasingly social liberal societies and countries, as well as the trends that we see in academia and in particular Western societies, but that's increasingly spreading to the rest of the world. So therefore, what is it that has happened among these social progressives? They have had the dilemma of having to deal with this psychological data. And so for them, they have attempted to re-examine the data, or to find new data, or to find models and theories of being able to explain away or undermine the gender differences hypothesis. But why would they do that? Why is that necessary? I mean, isn't this at the end of the day a science, and shouldn't the data speak for itself? Well, you know, as Rajab Hoja, my teacher, always has mentioned, you know, there's data and then there's the interpretation of data, right? And so the data may not necessarily be suiting to ideological beliefs and ideas, and therefore there's a necessity to be able to explain the data in a way that might fit the theoretical suppositions. What is that? Because, well, you know, as we see increasingly in Western societies, there's a huge re-socialization project, right? That the idea that males and females are exactly the same, psychologically, that is. Certainly there's an acceptance of biological differences, but, you know, the previous presenter went through sort of this overlap with biology and psychology. But there's this resocialization project. And so therefore, this doesn't fit very well with the resocialization project. And therefore, there needs to be kind of a way to be able to explain this data. So how do they explain it? So let me get through some of the theories and then go to the data itself. One of them is social constructivism, right? Which occupies about 20% of social studies individuals in the Western Academy subscribe to social constructivism. And they say that this is all socially constructed, meaning that there's actually no differences between genders psychologically. And social constructivists are also very, skeptical about science to begin with. and the field of psychology as a science. So they often kind of reduce psychology and science to the construction of powerful men that get together to make decisions and construct things like the DSM or other sorts of bodies to be able to advance their own patriotical claims and their agendas. So social constructivists dismiss it altogether. So that's an easy one to understand, right? They just say everything is socially constructed. Well, you know, if you say to them, well, isn't social constructivism a social construction itself? And this is the dilemma, right? The circle of social constructivism. Well, it's a theory that actually violates its own, that undoes its own theory. Now, what about others? The more prominent view among psychologists that are left-leaning subscribes to Egely's social role theory. Okay, and so this is kind of like dealing with the chicken or the egg problem. So what they say is, everybody know the chicken or the egg problem? Did the chicken come first or did the egg come first? Which one was created first? Is there a chicken that produced an egg, or did the egg come out in a chicken, and then that's how the cycle of the chicken was kind of born? So the idea is that you really can't answer the question because you can't go back in time and figure out which one it was. So there's a chicken or the egg kind of problem here, but they do take a particular position, reconstructing backwards as to what happened. So they say, look, there are real innate biological differences between men and women. That's obvious, right? But then what happens is that we see women and men that are biologically different, and then we make inferences and hypotheses about their psychological profile. And then we create stereotypes about these psychological profiles, and then we socialize our society accordingly. So what they're saying is there's actually no real psychological differences, but human beings have mistakenly assumed psychological differences between them because of biological differences, conflating the two. And then as a result, they say that there are, and they've socialized society for centuries like this, and that's why you have psychological differences between males and females. Just to make this case a little clearer, here's an example. For example, you'll take a female gives birth. So given that a female gives birth, right, that's a biological thing, then we assume, they say falsely, that women are probably more nurturing and caring and kind and compassionate. And this is erroneous according to them. And then we socialize this idea. We create the stereotype, tell everybody else, and then parents socialize their children, women, a girl, to be compassionate, caring, and nurturing. That's what they're saying is actually what's happening. And so there's no real psychological differences. Human beings have made a mistake for centuries, basically. And so now, in the modern era, they're saying if you can course correct, and re-socialize society around completely equal playing grounds between males and females, and not teach children gendered ideas, then you will actually equalize psychological differences. Now, keep this hypothesis in mind, because it's a very critical one to the sort of left-leaning socio-political kind of wing that needs what? Psychology or data to be able to advance and to verify and to confirm these ideological beliefs. So let's deal with this hypothesis. Well, there's a problem, first of all. The problem is that biology and psychology are interrelated, right? It's hard to be able to tease out and say men and women are just a set of different organs, okay? Why? Because those organs come with hormones that accompany them. And hormones are also responsible for contributing to behavior, emotion, and thinking, right? Therefore, Women are more likely to have oxytocin, especially the milk letdown release, which allows them to bond, also social bonding. And we also have data that women, when they are even with their spouses, when they they enjoy intimacy most when they socially bond, which also releases oxytocin as a hormone. For men, it's very interesting, and I'm going to come to this a little bit later, it's vasopressin that's released, which is another hormone, which is related to vision, right? And therefore, it's sexual intimacy, for example, is a lot more visual for men versus social bonding and emotional for women. So hormones are at play here. And then if you inject women with testosterone, aggressiveness also goes up, right? So it's traditionally the male hormone. So it's very difficult to kind of make tenable the argument that it's all socially constructed when we have biological, chemical evidence to show that men and women actually respond differently on account of varying hormones. Problem number 2, differences in personality. So now remember this hypothesis. If you equalize, right, the playing field for men and women, give them equal opportunity, right, and you don't socialize girls and boys to be girls and boys, you're going to increase, or it's rather decrease, gender differences psychologically. Well, guess what? There's a study that was conducted 2018, very recently, across 22 different countries, over 130,000 participants, using the Big Five, which is a very strong, statistically powerful instrument for assessing personality. And guess what they find? They find that gender differences in personality hold cross-culturally. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, which is a surprising finding, that among the most equal, liberal, and egalitarian societies, Scandinavia, for example, gender differences are actually greater psychologically than they are smaller. So, and actually in the publication it says a surprising finding, right? That's one of the sort of colons that comes after. And guess what? People who did this study were not conservatives. They were left-leaning social scientists. So it actually worked against and invalidated the hypotheses that they started with. Right? So this demonstrates that gender differences actually hold. Now, what's another theory that's another way of looking at gender differences? Well, traditionally the evolutionary psychology. Now, evolutionary psychology needs to be distinguished from evolution, the theory that we study in biology. Certainly they're related. There's continuity between them. But evolutionary psychology really says and affirms, and by the way, it's becoming a kind of, in psychology departments, it's becoming ostracized or targeted because they make the claim that men and women are different. And that is that their biological differences also are related to their psychological differences. And so they say that men and women have psychological differences that are consistent with their survival aims, differential survival aims, just like other animals, okay? So this is a bit more tenable, certainly. So for example, they will say that women give birth, going back to the same example, right? But women, first of all, before birth, when they're choosing a spouse to mate with, they're going to be choosier. Why are they going to be choosier? Because they want a man that's going to stick around, that's going to take care of them, that's going to be giving them some form of security. Therefore, they don't just want to mate with just anybody. Okay, so they're more selective than males are. Then, and they don't choose to have casual sexual intimacy. They're more, because they bear the cost of child rearing, because you have to bear this child for 9 months. You're stuck with this child. If a man, impregnates a woman, he disappears. They say women need to be more selective, need to be more careful. Women are physiologically weaker, and as a result, more vulnerable to sexual violence, which we still see today. And as a result, they are more neurotic, meaning apprehensive and anxious, because it's a fear-based response for safety, and therefore they're more likely to be more apprehensive. Women are also more detail-oriented. By the way, there's data to support all of this. They say, why? Because they raise children, and their sleeps are lighter, meaning they don't sleep as heavy as men do, and they're more responsive to noises, and they can actually differentiate noises much better than males can, differentiate different kinds of noise. Why? Well, because according to evolutionary psychology, their theory is that, well, women bear children, they take care of these children. As a result, they need to be attuned to the different cries that the baby has to be able to respond to them. They also respond to stress differently. So men and women, for example, they become stressed out really quickly, and then they calm down really quickly as well. So it's kind of this kind of graph. Whereas males, they take a lot longer to become stressed out, but when they do, they take a lot longer to also calm down from stress. Okay, so I give this kind of example of my own personal life just to kind of further illustrate the point. So, for example, if when I was a child, I did something bad, my mom might get really, really angry really quickly. Okay, and then about an hour later, she would come over to me and ask me if she could feed me if I'm hungry. And I thought this was confusing, right, as a child, because you thought, why does she want to feed me? She just laid it on me. But they calm down really quickly as well to be able to care for and take care of the needs of the child. Whereas, if I had upset my father, right, he wouldn't get angry really quickly, but if I had bothered him enough, once he got angry, I didn't really want to be around him for a while, okay? If I was, I might get hurt, okay? So that's why you can kind of appreciate that they're saying that there's these biological differences that play into human psychology as well in the way that people deal with things. There's also, by the way, marital research even takes some of this. For example, John Gottman says men and women are detail different, right? And they respond to details differently. So women, for example, will notice a lot of details. Men do not. So a wife goes and changes her hairstyle, right? And then they come back and she says, "Did you notice anything?" And he says, I don't know, you changed the room decoration. No, I completely changed my hair, right? And so there's a differential way that we see details there, whereas a woman often will notice the details and point it out to them. Did you notice that you have this on you or this? So they say this becomes also sometimes problematic in marriages because men often see bigger kind of horizons on account of visual spatial cortexes being stronger, and so they are less likely to see details than women are. Okay. Now coming back to this gender similarities argument, so we need to deal with this. So what do social role theorists do then, right? Because again, we have this data that I just presented to you. And so they're saying, no, like we made a mistake historically and we need to correct that. But then you say, wait, look at all this data. It's scientific, right? And look at this data across 22 countries. What do we do with that? Well, there's a gender similarities hypothesis, which I'm going to deal with. Hyde, for example, most notable for this. In 2005, she publishes this, and she does a meta-analysis of 128 published journals or articles and studies on gender differences. And then she wants to look at the effect sizes. Really, how different are men and women, looking at all this literature? which, by the way, is 2005. A lot more literature evolves later, but just take it as it is for now. What does she find? She says that 78% of effect sizes across different domains, for example, aggression, detail orientation, kind, compassion, assertiveness, aggressiveness, all of these things, she says that 78% of the domains that I went through show small to moderate effect sizes, okay? And then, so she's saying, since 78% of males and females, psychologically, are similar, and they only have small effect sizes, this supports the hypothesis that men and women are actually psychologically similar. They're the same, kind of a little bit of a leap, extrapolation. What's the problem with this? Well, the obvious problem is that, what about the 22%, okay, that's left over? The 22% shows a large difference between males and females. That's number one. Number two, even the 78%, small and moderate differences are still differences, right? They're not the same. And so her study actually proves the opposite argument if you look at it from a different lens in which you approach the problem. Now, small differences also make a very important, we're not saying that men and women are completely different. We're not different species, okay? Men and women, psychology shows, are generally similar to each other, psychologically speaking. They are more similar than they are different. That's a given, right? We're human beings at the end of the day. But there are significant differences found between the genders psychologically. So on average, even if males, for example, small differences also make a big difference in specialized settings. Meaning, for the vast majority of lay people, for example, it might not matter, right? Whether visuospatial arrangement is stronger in men and then other areas in women. Generally, they can just kind of get on with their lives because they're not required to utilize to the maximum those areas of their brain as a specialist would need to. For example, in engineering, right? Stem cell research, there's an overrepresentation of males in this area. The converse, right? In social sciences and psychology, overrepresentation of women, right? And so it's like the race. Like if you have an Olympic race, you have two very fast people. A few seconds makes a big difference in specialized settings. So when you come to engineering or highly competitive arenas, the gender differences actually do make a difference. Okay? That's why we see the differences. So vocationally speaking, right, we see that we can say, it's seeming that the data seems to suggest that men are generally thing-oriented, whereas women are more people-oriented. Okay, they're more interested in people, whereas men are more interested in things. Okay? And so that's why we see this huge discrepancy between social sciences of overrepresentation of women, and then, by the way, when you see men in social sciences, they do things like some of my students, like at ISAR, they're cognitive scientists. They go into cognition, right? And why'd you do that? Well, I don't know. I'm just kind of really interested in the mechanics of the brain here. So what about interactions? I mean, it's too complex for me, right? It's too fluid. It's too much ideas and thoughts and emotions. It's not as predictable. It's hard to deal with people. I just want to deal with something very systematic, very linear, okay? So on one hand, so women are generally more able to tolerate, right, ambiguity, whereas for men, ambiguity poses a problem. Okay, they need a little bit more of a structure laid down. Now, one thing I want to say as a disclaimer, as I'm going through this, because the objection might arise in the mind, well, I'm a woman and I like engineering. Or I'm a man and I like, well, look at me, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with people, I'm people interested, right? Does that mean I'm not a man? That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that there are general differences between males and females, and science is built on generalizations, right? There's always exceptions to the rule, but we want to understand generalizations, and that's really what I'm presenting here. So what about on the big five traits? Women tend to be more agreeable, right? Kinder, more compassionate, and women also tend to be more neurotic. Which is more, you'll see more moodiness, sadness, emotional instability, apprehension, fear, anxiety, okay, than men. When it comes to communication and socialization, I put these effect sizes here so you can appreciate, for those who know the science, the power of effect sizes. So we see some small to moderate differences in communication and socialization. The plus indicates women being more, men being more, and then negative indicates women being more on that trait, okay? So, for example, men tend to interrupt conversations more. Men tend to make intrusive interruptions. Women tend to smile more, okay? Women tend to self-disclose their personal secrets to close friends. Men are less likely to do that. Sexuality. Men are very visual when it comes to sexualization. This is why you see such a huge increase, a very large difference between males and females with regard to masturbation. Right? It's generally mostly a male problem, whereas certainly there are females, but again, overrepresentation of males. Attitudes about casual sex. Look at how huge the effect size is. This is plus 0.81. Arousal to sexual stimuli, meaning visual stimuli. Men are more aroused when they see visual stimuli than females are. Men have greater sense of body self-esteem, and certainly that is as a result of some social pressures put on women as well. But women tend to be much more preoccupied and conscious about their bodies, whereas men are not. As a result of neuroticism, remember we said neuroticism is linked with adverse psychological distress. Like what? Emotionality and depression. So women tend to have are like 2 to 1 for depression, anxiety, more self-conscious and more vulnerable. And we see this with the clinical diagnoses, for example. 35% of females have moderate to severe levels of depression compared to 19% of males. This is in response to COVID-19. 27% of females have moderate to severe levels of stress compared to 10% of males. 37% of women report suicidal thoughts compared to 17% of males. Now, what about males though, right? Because you said, well, are women sicker than men then? Is that what you're trying to say here? Because I have to be careful, right? I have female students, I have a wife that might want to listen to this, and so I may not be, treated very well if I come home after this presentation. So I need to be careful about the way that I present the data. So aggression and men tend to be more aggressive, right? Generally, therefore you see them overrepresented in antisocial personality disorder, right? This is why you see more males in prison, right? More male violence, more male deaths, for example. Alcoholism, men are more likely to be alcoholics. Actually, there's more, men have ADHD than women, which kind of makes sense because I can see this even in my own classes when I'm teaching students. See, girls are very engaged, and then men, after a few minutes, they're just like, looking out the window. What's wrong with you? Pay attention to what's going on. Well, if it's not Marvel or like lights, shining at you, people get very distracted very easily, right? So men tend to be a little bit more ADHD than women are on this continuum. Very interesting that I found this. I found it was kind of interesting. Despite the fact that men tend to be overall more physically aggressive, when it comes to intimate relationships, women tend to be equally as aggressive and sometimes more aggressive than males. And this actually even holds true for physical violence. So in some studies show that women are more physically like abusive, if we want to call it abuse, right, than men are in relationships. But obviously we know there's a power differential, and oftentimes men do not report these kinds of things, or they don't turn them into kind of grounds. Obviously there's power differential. When a woman hits a man, it may not have the damage that it does when it's the other way around. Women tend to be slightly more hardworking. I found this, I want to highlight it because, again, I find this also in some of my studies with students. Women are on top of things, they're detail-oriented, they're paying attention in class, turning in assignments, whereas at least the modern man, I mean, is a little bit not less so, right? I mean, you take the notes of, I mean, it's enough to just take the notes of a female student and a male student and look at them. The male student can't even read their own notes, let alone share it with anybody else, right? But oftentimes a woman's notes is like, wow, this is like cliff notes. Like you almost like neatly arranged this and organized it in a way that comes together so well. Just a quick, and again, I'm not getting deep into this. Muslim scholars have warned against socialization of males as females and females as males. They believe that it's a harm to children, it's a harm to people, it's a harm to society. I think we know sufficiently enough that Eastern societies and all of human history historically have always been organized by gender, differentially, socialized differently by gender, and treated differently and occupied different domains in gender. This is a really interesting book by Karen Popenoe in 2004 called Feeding Desire. She's an anthropologist. She goes to the Muslim world, and she spends time a year and conducts an ethnography in a Muslim society in Africa. And what she notices, by the way, before she goes, she has, in her own introduction to her own admission, she says that she has a little bit more of this feminist leaning. But she says that her ideas were drastically changed when she went to the society, and she found that society seemed to be really well organized between a complementarity between males and females, that males and females tended to be very comfortable having different roles that seemed to contribute to a very productive and satisfying society. The thing she also notes, which I want to also note, is the consequences of equality. Karen Popenoe makes this as well, is that there's a problem with this whole gender equality. By equal, I mean they're exactly equal. I don't mean equal opportunity. Certainly there's a case for equal opportunity. We'll never get equality of outcomes, which is also a progressive liberalist idea, that we want equality of outcome. Well, how can you ensure equality of outcome? Well, you need to have as many males in primary school as teachers and as many females in engineering. You create an artificiality of society that's impossible to achieve. That's number one. Number two, this is the thing that Karen Popenoe also mentions, is that why is the standard of maleness regarded as something that is to be achieved? The standard of success is gauged by maleness, even by liberalists who will assert that you can see kind of especially the early, now it's a little bit changing, the feminist movements sort of start to try to create maleness. They want to make women more assertive, type A type of personality. They want them to have the same careers, same occupations. Very interestingly enough, I mean, Karen Popenoe says this herself. She says she noticed, interestingly enough, why is it that women have to dress like men? Meaning, and she makes a very interesting kind of note. She says, look, even the suit, right? She says women have to wear the suit, but women actually put shoulder pads in the suit. And it's like, why are they putting shoulder pads in there? And she's talking about an obsession with maleness, that actually you're on some level affirming that maleness is somehow actually the ultimate success or the gauge, and then you want women to kind of be like that. right? And so this becomes this sort of problem. So I think there are dangers, because one might say, what's the problem? Why are you being so, why are these conservatives really pressing for a socialization of differential between males and females? Well, actually it's the other way around. Why are we resisting the current that's so natural to human beings for all of human history? And the dangers associated with it of what? Of reductions in childbirth, late marriages, right? For example, families and marriages are the worst that society has ever seen, right? Across human history. We have, what's interesting is a finding shows that the greater egalitarian liberalist views you have, the less satisfaction you have in your marriages. Why? Because you're imposing or need to, rather than acceptance of difference, you're trying to create an exact equality that ends up becoming a failed experiment and expectation on your end. We have, actually ostracizing and creating an academy that is increasingly totalitarian. I'm sure, I've heard Dr. Brown talk about this as well, and sort of the leftist leaning kind of academy that is really putting restraints on even language, right? And laws are being passed that are consistent with language. So this is the danger of imposing sort of this socialization project is really you're playing with all of society and all of humanity by trying to recreate a kind of a new sort of idea of the way that you're going to structure society and the way that you're going to create them. For example, children. Not gendering children, right? Giving them the choice even. Now that's even being put on the table, right? And so these are the dangers that are sort of associated with it. And so this was my presentation to kind of demonstrate that certainly psychology, in summary, psychology of genders and the differences between the genders are clear, and the data points to it. And if we want to be really objective about it, then we should look at the data and to say that, as objective scientists at least, we can say that the data points, empirical evidence, is sufficient proof to demonstrate that we don't need to try to interpret the data away, but rather let the data inform the way that we construct our ideas about gender and the way that we want to socialize our societies. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.